It all began in January 1947 in Hollywood, at the time already the heart of the film industry. The city was shaken by a terrible incident. The aspiring actress Elizabeth Short was found dead, her body horribly mutilated. This case was among the most famous unsolved crimes in the US until recently. Not far from where Elizabeth Short was found, there lived a rich but unhappy family by the name of Hodel. Their history holds several dark secrets that seem to be the key to what happened not only to Elizabeth, but to dozens of other young women in Hollywood. The Black Dahlia case is very well known, so we won't be touching upon the story of Elizabeth Short and will instead focus on the family that evidently played a decisive role in the events. And besides, the story of this family makes one's skin crawl. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support my channel. If you enjoy such videos about lesser known true crime stories, I will continue making them and find even more bewildering stories for you. In 2017, two sisters of the Hodel family, Yvette and Russia, visited a storage facility where their recently deceased mother, Fauna, had rented a spot for her things. Fauna was an interesting woman with a complicated life, and she spent 30 years recording and writing down everything that happened to her, conversations with friends and family, important events, and her own thoughts. She was writing her autobiography and the history of her family when in September 2017, Fauna died after a long battle with cancer. All of these recordings were left in storage, which her daughters then visited. The sisters would say of themselves that they're complete opposites. They had different fathers, so Russia is light-skinned while Yvette is darker. Russia is shorter and stockier. Yvette is thinner and taller. Russia is married to a woman and Yvette to a man. Together, the sisters were going through dust-covered things in storage, looking at old photographs, opening one box after another, flipping through diaries where Fauna wrote down her thoughts and poetry. In one of those boxes, they found some dusty audio tapes. They had never seen them before, though they knew that Fauna often recorded things. The tapes were labeled, revealing that they were recordings of conversations that Fauna had with some family members. One of the tapes was labeled Tamar, for instance, the first name of Fauna's mother. The sisters found themselves most interested in the tape titled Now I Am Free, and played it as soon as they could. There, they heard their mother's voice, still very young.
Now I am free. From the age of 12, I knew my story would be written. Why? I had a mother who was a drunk. She detested me, and I detested her drinking. Mama was black, and I was white. Growing up in the late 50s and early 60s with such odds, I knew if we outlive the circumstances, this would be a story to tell.
Fauna grew up in a foster family raised by a black woman named Jimmy. She knew she was adopted since she was 5. Jimmy herself told Fauna about her real, biological family and how Fauna ended up with Jimmy. It was the early 50s. Segregation was rampant, and should a white woman have given birth to a dark-skinned baby, it would have been better to put it up for adoption. This was the story Fauna was told. Jimmy Lee was working as a maid in the restrooms of the Riverside Casino Hotel in Nevada when a woman came up to her and asked if she wanted a child. The woman explained that her daughter was due to give birth soon. Jimmy was shocked and didn't take the proposal seriously at first. After a few months, however, she agreed. She felt sorry for the baby, and she was told the child was from a notable family, so they would be very grateful. Besides, Jimmy's husband was a staunch believer and thought that since they had no children of their own, this was a sign from heaven. Jimmy had a drinking problem, and her husband hoped that having a child would help her drop the habit. The baby was Fauna Hodel. Her biological mother, Tamar Hodel was only 15 at the time. When Jimmy arrived at the hospital to pick up the child, she found that Fauna was far from black, but rather a blue-eyed blonde. She was assured, however, that mixed-race children are often born light-skinned and that this changes over time. Jimmy quickly realized that she would have to give the kid a different name. She called her Pata, a slang name for whites, and thus Fauna Hodel, now known as Pat Faison, came to live in the city of Sparks, Nevada, in a completely black family. The family had a difficult time in the black community, having to constantly explain that Fauna Pata was mixed race and that her skin would darken with time. This was corroborated by her birth certificate, which stated that her father was black. Fauna would later carry the certificate with her at all times, so that people would stop asking questions about her skin color. She wanted to be like all the other kids in the neighborhood and spend hours in the sun, hoping to brown even just a bit. Meanwhile, Fauna's adoptive mother, Jimmy, despite her husband's hopes, continued drinking, losing control, and becoming aggressive when inebriated. Fauna's childhood wasn't a particularly happy one. When she was 12 years old, Jimmy, in one of her fits of rage, threw Fauna out of the house, and she spent the next 3 years living with different uncles and aunts, and occasionally even in somebody's car. She never did become dark-skinned. At 15, Fauna got pregnant from a black man and gave birth to her first daughter, Yvette. At about the same time, she started wondering if her life would have been better had she grown up with her biological mother. Spoiler, it wouldn't have. In 1969, Fauna Hodel started the search for her biological mother. She wrote a letter to the hospital that she was born in, where she was told that they didn't know the whereabouts of her mother. They said that they hadn't seen her after she gave birth, but added it wasn't her who decided to give the child up for adoption. She was very young and made the decision under pressure from her mother, Fauna's grandma. Having heard this, Fauna didn't give up, and soon found out an important detail. Her mother was from Los Angeles and not from San Francisco, where Fauna was born. Fauna picked up the phone book and called all the Hodels in town. At some point, she stumbled upon a distant relative who gave her the address of Fauna's grandfather, who was living in Japan. She sent him a letter, and in a few weeks, her telephone rang. The caller introduced himself as George Hodel, her grandfather. She explained that Fauna's mother, his daughter, was living in Hawaii and gave Fauna her number. Fauna was 20 years old when she finally dialed the number of her biological mother, Tamar. She introduced herself and said she was looking for her mother, and a female voice, very similar to her own, responded. Tamar was shocked by this call. It wasn't something she had ever expected, but the question that Fauna asked in the first minute of their conversation shocked her even more. Was her father really black? Tamar kept silent for a bit and then considered that this wasn't true. Fauna's father was white. The story about him being black was made up by Tamar's mother, Dorothy. They decided to give Fauna to a black family because Tamar had grown disenchanted by whites and the violent culture she was exposed to, and hoped to keep her baby far away from what was happening in the houses of white elites. This truth crushed Fauna. Everything she knew about herself turned out to be a lie. Tamar herself suffered greatly, having given up her daughter for adoption. After she gave birth, she wasn't even allowed to hold her. The nurses showed her daughter to her through the glass and then took her away. For the next 20 years, Tamar didn't forget about her daughter, regretting her decision to give her up. But now they finally found each other and had the chance to settle things. However, every family has its skeletons in the cupboard, and the Hodel cupboard had only just begun opening its doors. For 2 years, Tamar and Fauna conversed over the phone until Fauna had saved up enough money to go visit her biological mother in Hawaii. Together with her daughter Yvette, she packed their bags and flew over to Tamar. Their encounter was an emotional one. In spite of the fact that Tamar was 5 hours late to the airport, the three of them got into Tamar's car and went to her house. Almost immediately, through the fog of joy, Fauna started noticing odd things about Tamar. Her house was very untidy, the air thick with the smell of marijuana. In the middle of the room sat Tamar's 3 sons aged 7, 5, and 3, Fauna's brothers. The eldest was named Peace on Earth, the second one Joy to the World. The youngest one was named simply Love. All of them had different fathers. Tamar also had a grown-up daughter, the 18-year-old mixed-race Deborah Elizabeth, who called herself Fauna. Tamar struggled greatly with the loss of her first daughter, taking her anger out on Deborah, who had no choice but to become her mother's lost daughter Fauna. Thus, in one house there were now 2 Faunas, 3 boys with strange names, and their mother, who had started all this mess. But these weren't the only unexpected twists and turns. Fauna and Tamar were nonetheless happy to reunite and spent the whole night telling each other about their lives. Tamar told her daughter about her family, including her grandfather George Hodel, with whom Fauna had had a phone conversation. George was a genius doctor, a scientist with an IQ equal to Einstein's, and a well-known socialite in Hollywood, where he lived for a long time before moving to East Asia. However, he treated his family horribly. Tamar didn't reveal any details of this that night, but instead told her daughter another bone-chilling story that Grandpa George was the prime suspect in the case of Elizabeth Short, known to the public as the Black Dahlia. This case was a famous one, so Fauna immediately knew what her mother was talking about. But the murder had remained unsolved for decades, and this was a claim no one had ever heard before. And does it really matter what the rumors around George might be? For reference, Elizabeth Short was killed on January 15, 1947, in an incredibly violent way. The case has since become a staple of forensic science, with many books written and several films made about the investigation and associated theories. What the first policeman to arrive on the scene saw was so gruesome that even now many detectives say they've never seen anything more horrible. Elizabeth's body was put on display on a lawn in a residential neighborhood. Her legs were wide apart, her arms were thrown behind her head, and her face was cut into a horrifying smile. The killer was obviously trying to say something. There wasn't much evidence at the crime scene, but something else was interesting. Several cement bags and several fertilizer packages were found next to the body, most likely used for transportation. This was a very ingenious decision on the part of the killer. One could safely say that he was a smart and calculating person who had carefully planned everything. In addition, Elizabeth's torso was separated from the lower part of the body, and the incisions were accurate enough to have been made by a professional doctor. Forensic scientist Ray Pinker, who worked on this case, called surgeons for help. He simply couldn't believe that someone without a medical degree could have done this. The surgeons confirmed that the incision corresponded to a registered procedure that was studied at medical universities in the 1930s, a hemicorporectomy. Such a cut is the only way to divide the body into 2 parts without breaking any bones, something a person without the relevant education wouldn't know how to do. Initially, the investigators had a list of about 300 suspects, but it soon shortened considerably. The list was confidential, but there was indeed one George Hodel on it, Fauna's grandfather and Tamar's father. LA policemen already knew his name. He had been a suspect in another case, but was acquitted. So who was George Hodel? George Hodel was born in Los Angeles in 1907. He was an only child and greatly loved in the family. He was considered a prodigy almost since he was born. Indeed, He was talented at everything. As a child, he played the piano and even gave recitals at age 9. However, George hated his mother because she didn't let him play with other kids, fearing he might damage his musical fingers. When his mother passed away, George gave up music and never returned to it. George was very smart. He always got high grades in school and even went down in Los Angeles history as the kid who got the highest scores in public school exams. In high school, he took an IQ test. Anyone who scores more than 140 is considered a genius. George scored 186. After graduating from school, he entered Caltech at the age of 15. He was not only smart, but also quite lascivious. In college, George had a relationship with his professor's wife. She got pregnant from him, left her husband, and moved to Massachusetts. George followed her, wanting to marry her and raise their child, but she refused, and George never saw her again. This rejection made a very strong impact on George, which was made even worse by the fact that when he returned to LA, he found out that he was expelled from the university for his affair. The then 17-year-old Hodel decided to take up art. He began to publish a newspaper in which he wrote about surrealism, the love of which he would carry through his whole life. Being a big fan, he considered this movement very progressive and wrote about his search for hidden meanings within surrealist art. These are not just interesting facts, they will become part of the bigger picture that we will paint for this story. George ardently wished to become a man of art. He surrounded himself with all sorts of different artists, but wasn't himself successful in his artistic endeavors, which angered him deeply. Having left surrealism to parties at home, George went to medical school and after graduating as a surgeon, started working in the Bureau of Social Hygiene. In the 1930s and 1940s, venereal diseases were very common. 10% of the US population had been diagnosed with syphilis at least once, and 20 to 40% had gonorrhea. STDs were heavily stigmatized, seen as a feature of a prostituted woman, and if a politician was diagnosed with such a disease, his career was as good as over, unless this information were to be hushed up. This was why George Hodel became such an influential doctor. He knew the diseases of all the richest people in Los Angeles and gladly used this knowledge for selfish purposes. Only many years later will the police find out that Hodel sometimes intentionally lied to patients about their diagnosis in order to use their connections and get money from them. He also had contact with all the clinics and doctors that offered illegal abortions, which also increased his influence. At the time, a secretary named Ruth Spalding worked for George Hodel. She accidentally found out these dark secrets of his and was planning to tell everything to the police. But after she told George about her plans, she died. Here's what happened. One evening in 1945, George Hodel called his wife and asked her to come over to Ruth's place. She was allegedly lying unconscious on her bed, having tried to commit suicide, but George assured she could still be saved. George's wife came over and picked up some documents that he asked her to burn. These turned out to be confirmation of Hodel's illegal affairs. George waited for his secretary to fall into a coma and then took her to the hospital, where she died after 20 minutes. The court found that Hodel wasn't guilty of her death, though this decision may have been influenced by George's bribes and connections. George returned home to his wife and children in 1946. The family moved into a curious new place, the so-called Franklin House. A truly unique residence. It was built in 1926 by Lloyd Wright, son of legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and the Hodel family lived here till 1950. The exterior of the house is strange and eerie, but that's exactly what George Hodel liked about it, being a fan of all things unusual and scary. By 1949, the residence housed the doctor and his wife, 3 sons, Steve, Kelly, and Michael, and Hodel's daughter, Tamar, whose mother wasn't his current wife, but rather another woman named Dorothy Barb. This was the Tamar that would get a visit from Fauna in Hawaii 2 decades later. At the time, Tamar was 14, and her mother decided that she would live with her father, which was how she ended up in the imposing and scary house. There, Tamar found a strange way to entertain herself. She would sit absolutely naked in front of the house, pretending to be a statue, and when passers-by came close, she would suddenly move, frightening them. George Hodel pretended not to notice anything odd about this, and only forbade Tamar from doing this once the police started paying attention. As his sons will later recall, George was a strange and cold man who didn't particularly like children. He would frighten them by pretending to be God through the loudspeakers on the wall. The best time that George's sons spent with him was during their trips in his army jeep. However, once they arrived, George would get out of the car, forbidding his sons to leave it. Sometimes they would wait for hours for him to return. As it will turn out later, George used his jeep trips to visit his mistresses. George believed sex to be the main force on the planet, controlling absolutely everything, like a perverse form of gravity. His house was often witness to orgies, which included his wife Dorero. We don't know whether she participated in them willingly or not, since she was definitely afraid of George. George and Dorero divorced in 1946, but she and their sons continued living in the Franklin house, which became the hub for George's surrealist friends. Alcohol, drugs, and sex were present at every party. George Hodel invited surrealist artists and photographers that he was a passionate fan of, and was acquainted with all the proponents of the movement who worked in LA at the time. Between drinks, they discussed Sigmund Freud and Marquis de Sade, and George's connection to sadism will prove to be more than rhetorical. George let his friends take pictures of Tamar naked. They believed that all taboos were losing relevance and would soon die out. George's sons have only vague recollections of these parties, since they were little boys at the time. They remembered beautiful women in luxurious dresses and without them, as well as foggy images of men doing whatever they wished. Unfortunately, the 14-year-old Tamar remembered the details much better. George requested her presence at every party. Tamar saw many things, but one day, something exceptionally horrible happened. George asked Tamar into his room and got undressed, saying that a great honor had befallen her. She complied with his orders. She was embarrassed and disgusted, and when it was all over and she came to her senses, she told her mother about what had happened. She didn't believe Tamar, and George wasn't planning on stopping. He told her that it was her privilege and that he would make her a woman. Soon, Tamar became pregnant. George found this amusing. At first, he wanted for her to have the child, but soon sent her to a friend of his to get a backstreet abortion. Tamar realized that she needed to run away from home, a realization that was strengthened by George's wife, Dorero, who told Tamar that George had killed his secretary and was capable of anything. Tamar managed to escape, but the police found her. She was hiding at a friend's place and told the police all the terrible details of her life, remembering everything from violence and rape to the backstreet abortion. Soon, George Hodel was officially charged with crimes against morality. During a search of his house, police found many odd photos and pornographic materials, to which Hodel replied that he was trying to understand love. Perhaps now, he will finally be punished and put in prison. George Hodel's trial began in 1949, and all the newspapers widely publicized the case of the famous Hollywood doctor. George got himself the best attorney in town, and their key witness against Tamar was her own mother, Dorothy Barb. She called Tamar a pathological liar. With such words coming from the mother herself, the jury took the side of the father, with George winning the case against his daughter and against the truth. When leaving the court hall, George shook hands with several jury members, which might give us a clue to certain arrangements. Aside from Dorothy's testimony, Tamar's credibility was spoiled by something else. During questioning, Tamar told the police that her father was the one who killed Elizabeth Short. Perhaps she overheard some conversations among the officers or had heard something at home, but this claim only strengthened the belief that she was a liar. Failing to get justice, Tamar would grow up severely traumatized. In the future, she would give 5 children from 5 different men. Fauna Hodel, whom she gave up for adoption, would be the first of them. Fauna's father will remain unknown for a very long time. It was rumored that it could very well have been George himself because Tamar became pregnant a year after the trial, and her father's behavior hadn't changed in the meantime. But Yvette and Russia didn't want to believe that their mother was the child of Tamar and George, an understandable wish. Let's go further down the Hodel family tree and acquaint ourselves with one of George's sons that he had with Dorothy Huston. Of interest to us is Steve Hodel, who has worked in the police force for his whole life and solved over 300 murders since 1963. He is now retired, but still an active investigator. In 1999, he received a phone call from June, the 5th wife of his father. Crying into the phone, she asked Steve to come as soon as possible. George Hodel had passed away. He was 91 years old, had 5 wives, and fathered at least 11 children. Steve found out that George died from an overdose of pills. A suicide note was found next to George in which he asked June to get rid of all his things. June followed his husband's last request, with one exception. She didn't want to burn the family photo album and instead gave it to Steve. When flipping through the photographs, Steve noticed a picture of a pretty dark-haired woman who wasn't a family member. For some reason, the name of Elizabeth Short immediately came to mind. By the time Steve started working in the police, the Black Dahlia case, though formally still open, became something of a textbook story that nobody seemed particularly interested in actually solving. Steve recognized Short because he remembered her story from his days in the police academy. What was her photo doing at George's place? Steve returned home and had nearly forgotten about the album. When a week after his father's death, his phone rang. It was his half-sister, Tamar. In difficult times, such as a parent's death, siblings should support each other after all. Steve and Tamar hadn't been in contact for a long time, but now they finally discussed pretty much everything. At some point, Tamar mentioned that their father was a suspect in the Black Dahlia case. Having heard this, Steve was indignant. How could this be? Steve decided he would defend his father's reputation and show Tamar and the whole world that George was innocent. Little did Steve know about how his investigation would go. First, Steve examined the letters that the supposed Black Dahlia killer had sent to the press and police, and saw to his horror that they bore a chilling resemblance to his father's handwriting. He even had graphologists compare the letters. Furthermore, Steve found out that the police had suspected from the very beginning that the murderer had a medical degree, and as we know, George was a surgeon. But all of this could be a simple coincidence. After Steve started his quest, the daughter of one of the detectives who had been on the case 50 years ago sent Steve photos of the crime scene that he had not found in the police department. These piqued his interest because of the way the girl's body was placed. He knew the murderer was trying to say something with it, but couldn't quite figure out what. At one point, Steve recalled one of his father's close friends, the surrealist photographer Man Ray. Ray and his wife often visited the Hodel residence and took part in their orgies. Ray also became the Hodel's family photographer. George and Man Ray talked a lot about art. with Ray as most surrealist considering the female body an object that served art. He wanted to shock the surrealists, be better than them, and break all established norms. And George wanted to be like Ray. So one day, Steve Hodel was flipping through the albums of Man Ray's works when he noticed a photograph called Minotaur. It depicted the torso of a woman, her arms splayed on her sides, exactly like those of Elizabeth Short. Steve couldn't believe his eyes. Later on, he found more similarities between Elizabeth Short's murder and Man Ray's works. His lovers showed a parallel to Elizabeth's cutout Eternal Smile, while another work echoed the cuts of the scalpel. Steve also found a picture of Man Ray's wife, Juliet, lying on the couch with her eyes closed in much the same position that Elizabeth Short was discovered in. The parallels were eerily accurate, which was proven by art historians who examined the photos of the crime scene. Steve Hodel talked to Steve Kay from the LA District Attorney's office, who, upon seeing this evidence, said that had George Hodel still been alive, he would have filed murder charges against him and won the court case. There was something else in the police archives. They held transcripts from the period in which George Hodel's home was bugged. Yes, the police had organized a stakeout at his residence. As I promised, this story just keeps getting better. The bugging was done by a policeman named Walter Morgan, who did the job with several sound technicians, while Hodel was being interrogated at the Hall of Justice. Given George's connections, it's a miracle these transcripts were still intact. The reason for this was that one of the detectives had hidden them in a vault, and they were forgotten about. Many years later, the secret Black Dahlia files would finally get into the hands of the prime suspect's son, Steve Hodel. It should be noted that the loss of files, transcripts, and even whole cases was a common occurrence in LA at the time. Police departments were so corrupt that pretty much anything could be bought. Bribes were ubiquitous, and those policemen who refused to take them often got into trouble and lost their job. This could have been the real reason why Elizabeth Short's case wasn't solved at the time. The first thing that Steve found out from these files was that during Tamar's court case, one of the witnesses, Lillian Lenorak, committed perjury. She said that Tamar didn't have an abortion, but the files showed that she was the one who told the police about Tamar's abortion. Lillian was afraid of Hodel because he threatened to take away her kids should she tell the truth, so she lied under oath. The files also showed that Hodel paid his attorney to bribe the judge. Lillian Lenorak wanted to tell the district attorney that she had lied, but was too intimidated to do so. Steve also found corrected files with the witnesses' testimonies. For instance, the words of one witness saying George knew Elizabeth Short were crossed out and changed to didn't know. Finally, Steve came to the transcripts from George Hodel's house. The next day after the house was bugged, Hodel was talking to some man who had a German accent. This conversation happened 3 months after the court case that George had so easily won.
This is the best payoff I've seen between law enforcement agencies. You do not have the right connection. I'd like to get a connection made in the DA's office. Any imperfections will be found. They have to be made perfect. Don't confess ever. 2 and 2 is not 4. We're just a couple of smart boys. They are out to get me. 2 men in the DA's office were transferred and demoted because of my trial. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary.
The transcripts also show that at one point, terrible screams of a woman were heard in the basement, but they didn't last long. Steve believes that George and his German friend assaulted another woman that night. A heavy metal object falling to the floor and blows can be heard in the recordings. Curiously enough, the detectives heard all the screams and the noise, but did nothing to save the woman in the basement. When talking to his friend in the basement, George showed him something under the floor, saying, "Not a trace." It remains unclear what he was talking about. George had several more meetings with his German friend, and in these conversations he often mentioned Elizabeth Short, as well as his desire to leave the country. Hodel was definitely afraid of something. This all took place in the year of 1950. Several days after the last recording, George Hodel left Los Angeles. He would spend the next 40 years in Hawaii, Japan, and the Philippines. He became a new person and made a new family. George Hodel was never arrested again. It's as if he was untouchable in spite of all the evidence and the recordings. No one seemed to pay any attention to them, even though they practically held George's confession. Meanwhile, Steve Hodel continued his search. He found that UCLA archives held files about the house in which the family lived in the late 1940s. There, Steve discovered a folder with the name Hodel written on it. Curious, Steve opened it and found receipts for contracting work on the house. The dates on a few of them were still visible, the 9th and 10th of January 1947, only 5 days before Elizabeth Short's body was found. So what did the inhabitants of the house buy in January of 1947? Bags of concrete and packs of fertilizer, the same size and brand found near Short's body. The same fertilizer was also found in her stomach. Steve wrote a book about all of his findings under the title Black Dahlia Avenger, The True Story. In 2017, he received a letter from a woman who said her father was a police informant. She attached a letter from her father in which he wrote that he knew a man with the initials GH and knew him as the Black Dahlia murderer. The author of the letter was afraid that this GH would harm his daughters, which was why his letter about the murder was only to be opened in case something should happen to his children. He also wrote that everyone in the police knew the murderer's name. Thus, all the evidence seems to point to George. But for Steve to bring his investigation to a close, one final test is still needed. Several years ago, at an exhibition dedicated to Elizabeth Short, Steve saw several envelopes in which the alleged killer sent letters to newspapers and the police. One of the envelopes, dated to George Hodel's birthday, had a small stamp still on it. Sticking a stamp to an envelope means licking it, and saliva can provide a DNA sample. Steve had already obtained samples of his father's DNA, and after finding the stamp, he immediately wrote to the LAPD, asking them to test it and compare the samples. However, the police refused to do so, citing a lack of resources. Can you imagine? But Steve refuses to give up, although he admits that it's very difficult for him. After all, he spent over 20 years working on this case. Some of his relatives think he's mad, but Steve just wants to achieve justice. One way or the other, George Hodel lived a long life without confessing or apologizing to his children. It seemed that with his death, the trials and tribulations of his family would be over, but it's not easy to break the cycle of violence. Tamar, George's unlucky daughter, began to imitate his sadistic inclinations. Perhaps she was too traumatized by George, and perhaps echoes of her father's dark nature grew in her over time. One day, when Steve Hodel was talking to Tamar over the phone, his half-sister said something strange. Sorry for that awkward moment in bed. Steve didn't understand what she was talking about, and Tamar explained that when they both lived in the Franklin house, they were intimate. Steve was horrified. He didn't remember anything like that. Tamar was then 13 and he was 8, and the same fate awaited Tamar's other brother, Kelly. That is, apparently Tamar did to them what had been done to her. Tamar was very beautiful, and many compared her to Marilyn Monroe. It was no surprise that as a grown woman, she had many men. Soon after giving birth to Fauna, and giving her up for adoption, Tamar became pregnant again and had her second daughter, Deborah Elizabeth, whom she called Debbie. Her middle name was chosen by George Hodel himself, and later Deborah would find out that she was named after Elizabeth Short. How does one live knowing something like that? As mentioned before, Tamar often turned her anger on Debbie and forced her to procure drugs for her. One of Tamar's close friends was Michelle Phillips from the popular band The Mamas and the Papas, and they often engaged in the consumption of illegal substances to which Debbie was witness. Tamar and her daughters did not have it easy, but things became even worse. After a failed suicide attempt, Tamar completely lost control and started doing to Deborah what her father did to her, saying she did it to calm Debbie. She started asking over friends and other people and started selling Deborah to them. This went on till Debbie gave birth to 2 children when she was 15. Debbie recalls her grandfather coming over to visit and making her write odd essays, like one 12-page long essay about the female breasts. He would only give Tamar money if he could spend time with his granddaughter. Once, Debbie was sent to have lunch with him at the hotel. George gave her a drink that knocked her out. She doesn't remember what happened that day, recalling only her grandfather being undressed and a camera. Tamar knew about this, yet sent her daughter over to George anyway. Moreover, Tamar constantly talked about her favorite daughter, Fauna. So when she was 12, Debbie asked her mother to start calling her Fauna, hoping this would help them both. Debbie didn't think she would ever get to meet her sister. Tamar's boys, Peace, Joy, and Love, didn't have it easy either. They were allowed to smoke marijuana and develop an unhealthy perception of sexuality from what they saw at home. In the future, they will have to undergo therapy so as to somehow alleviate the suffering that George Hodel and their own mother caused them. When Fauna came to Tamar's house, she saw this chaos: drugs, strangers, screams, and groans. And she just wanted to leave as soon as possible, which she did, whereas Tamar had an explanation for everything. On the tape found in storage, she can be heard saying that she did not know how else to do things. Having gone through hell as a child, she believed that she was doing well for her children. She repeated that she loved her kids, but Fauna didn't believe this. Thus, it turned out that Fauna was lucky to have been adopted by Jimmy's family. Who knows what could have awaited her at the Hodel's family. Now, the younger members of the Hodel family are trying to move on. Fauna Hodel lived a long and happy life and died in 2017, while her daughters, Yvette and Russia, created a podcast to tell her fascinating story to the world. A movie was made based on her memoirs. Steve Hodel is still trying to get tests done to compare DNA. A recent test of Fauna's DNA dispelled her and her daughter's worst fear, showing that her grandfather George could not have been her father. At least, that's something good. The children of Tamar Hodel, despite all they had to go through during childhood, went on to have proper functioning families, though they do have to live every day with the realization of all the terrible things connected to their family, but life goes on nonetheless. That's our story for today. I will continue following the investigation and hope that C will be able to prove his theory. As for George and Tamar, their story only confirms that violence is a vicious cycle. The question is, how did it start? What did George experience? What did he see? What aberrations did he have in his mind that he started this chain of horrors? There is a lot of information about this family's history, including an 8-hour-long podcast that I listened to when preparing this video, which offers stories of Tamar and Fauna taken from Fauna's recordings. It's very interesting material. I'll leave a link for you to listen. Thanks for watching this video to the end. Leave your thoughts in the comments and send the link to your friends. Perhaps they will find this story just as interesting. If you like this video and want more content like this, subscribe to my channel and share any ideas you may have about what other cases I should have in mind. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.